Here is a purple ink by Sailor Studio 723.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
We have here a very dark, beautiful purple, so dark it might pass as a black if it wasn't for that something else purple showing through in the writing. I've come more and more to appreciate inks that look like this on the page. In the past, I would have felt it was just a bit too dark, but all of the inks I've looked at have really helped alter some of that view. And yes, there is some tone variation by pen in extreme cases. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same consistent tone from every pen. It does show shading with one pen, but none of the others, leaving me that this really isn't a shading ink, though it technically could with the right situation. It's just a beautiful, well-executed dark purple that I really enjoy using.
The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get with this ink, and it is still a nice, beautiful, dark purple. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It does shade, and as I mentioned, it's really only with this pen that you're going to see the shading happen. You see it in Golem. You see how it starts a little darker, lightens up, gets dark again towards the end of the word. Began right next to it, starts dark, gets light, gets dark again. Pleasure on the second line, dark to light to dark. Here's some shading that I really was not expecting from this ink. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a lot darker than it was with the soft fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading that we had in the soft fine, just a very solid dark purple the entire way. And it's so dark, this is where you can see that it almost could pass for being a black, except for that something that I mentioned that keeps it being a purple, and just enough so. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone that we got with the wet fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. I think the slightly thicker line here really does a little bit more for it in terms of how it looks on the page compared to the wet fine. I think the thicker line really shows it as being a super dark purple, almost to the point of black. This really does show it, I think, the best. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tiny bit darker than it was with the medium nib. Just the tiniest bit. No feathering, no spread, no shading. I think while it's a little bit darker, the purple is showing a little bit nicer here. Still could possibly pass for a black if people didn't know exactly what they were looking at. Yet it holds on to that something for being a purple, doing so nice and really an enjoyable tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We still get some shading coming through. I'm thinking the shading shows a little nicer here, even though it's not shading anymore. I think it shows a little bit nicer. Take a look at Bilbo's right on the first line. Starts dark, lightens ever so slightly in the L, gets very dark at the bows at the end. Said on the second line directly underneath it, lighter to darker. I think the shading here again is showing itself off better than it did on the Clairfontaine, though not doing it anymore. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, we get a little less of that purple showing through. This quite possibly would pass as a black on this paper. I'm just not really getting that kind of purple little hints of it coming through, making it feel a little lost in some of its best qualities. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone that it was with the wet fine nib, just a hair darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading whatsoever. We still have lost that little bit of something purple, and it really is looking like a black ink here to me on the page, which is unfortunate because that very dark purple that just was a little bit of its purple was very nice. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that it was with the medium, the same tone that it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading. However, while it's just as dark as it was with the medium, I do think that it's managing to show some of that purple coming through. You see it, the purple coming through in the word boat on the first line, or in legs on the second, and sat on the third. It really is showing again that it's a purple. Strange that it's back, but I'm happy that it is back. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it is ghosting. The ink got pretty deep in there, especially with the medium. I don't know about writing on the back of the page for a majority of them, though you could easily with the soft fine. But nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, showing off the purple, I think, a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. It is showing as a very dark purple and not as a black, at least in person. No feathering, no spread, a very nice shading. The shading, again, is showing just as well, if not slightly better than it did on the Clairfontaine. When it's dark, it's darker. Other than that, we get a darker midtone. Look at got some, first two words on the first line, or time and right on the second line. Right starting as a nice midtone, getting darker. Time starting darker, lightening up just a bit at the M, and then very dark at the E. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. A bit darker, quite a bit darker, really, than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, no shading, not passing as a black, or sorry, as a purple at all. It's lost some of that purpleness again. The tone of the paper here, with it being a wetter pen than the soft fine, it's really coming across just as a black, a very fine looking black on the page, but considering it should be a dark purple, it's losing something for me. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone that it was with the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, still being a black, not so much a dark purple as a result of the tone of the paper, but that's what that is. If it were a black, it's a beautiful black with no shading whatsoever. It's great performance, no feathering and no spreading, but now it's looking black and not like a very dark purple. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that it was with the medium. Little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, still being a black here, not so much being a purple. I was kind of hoping that the purple would return as what was really being seen, but no, it is merely a black on the page. No feather, no spread, no shading, no thank you for a combination here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is really under control. You could write back here if you wanted to and not have any real problems. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, making it pretty decent as long as you're okay with it being black on the page.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We're not getting as much shading as we had on the Clairfontaine, though it is present. You see it in the word things on the second line where it starts a little darker, works its way lighter, and at the end of the S gets dark again. Where devours starts light on the D, gets dark, and after the E lightens up until it gets to the RS at the end, showing some very nice qualities as far as the shading comes through. That pen is really good at bringing out different features of an ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. We still have a very nice dark purple looking beautiful on the page though. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tiny bit darker than it was with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. No, it is not a black. It is a super dark purple, holding on to that purple look of the ink and really giving it a something nice to look at. Like I said, this was a very enjoyable ink for me to use, and this is showing why, even though there's no shading in any of the writing. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium nib, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a very definite dark purple look at things. That is not black, that is a dark purple. Beautiful. He had same thing, very dark purple, unmistakable as a very dark purple, not passing as a black here, not to me anyway. No feather, no spread, no shading. Without the shading, it still looks great on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Andy Warhol Pop Art Purple. Here is KWZ Berry. Here is Noodler's Blue Upon the Plains of Abraham.
Here is Sailor Studio 650.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. A little bit flatter a tone as well. Still holding on to being that purple and not passing as a black, but really being a very dark purple. So I'm happy with what's going on. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we still get shading just as well as it has on the Clairfontaine. You see it in tone variations of entire words like that and began directly beneath it. And sometimes within the same word, you get some very nice shading, like on the second line, for starting dark, getting light. Thinking, starting dark, getting light in the middle, darkening at the K, and then lightening up again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, though we are getting some shading here. Take a look at the second line where you see tongue and it starts darker, lightens up, gets dark again, and seamed starts lighter and gets darker, where to darker to lighter. So here, the wet fine nib is giving some very nice shading unexpectedly. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone that we had with the wet fine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get no shading. The shading for some reason went away here, and after seeing it with the wet fine, I was really looking forward to seeing shading show up here, and it didn't, which was kind of disappointing, though I like how the color looks on the page, and I really appreciate how it is still very much a dark purple, though a bit more muted on this paper. I was hoping for some shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tiny bit darker than it was with the medium, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. Look at more on the first line, lighter to darker. And I'm saying lighter, and it's really a mid-tone to a dark tone. Take a look at also compared to timed or tired on the second line. Also is lighter than the word tired. Of is a tiny bit darker than the word tired. It's progressing through the writing, but down to the third line, had starts dark and gets light. Now, something else that does stand out is how this ink sort of separates off some of these lines. If you look at it on the second line, it's those vertical lines that are sort of separating the ink. The ink is not really getting into that particular part of the paper because of those lines. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diatramentis Document Green. Here is a gray ink by Mont Blanc 90 Years Gray. Here is a pink ink by Pen BBS number 137.
Here is a yellow ink by Montegrappa Harry Potter Hufflepuff.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, though very tiny and really controllable. It does have a little bit of spread, but not all the way up to a medium, kind of like a fine medium. It does shade. You see it in boat, you see it in sat, you see it in the and dark and by, all of it. It shades very well here, which is great for how the ink can look. And I think this is a very usable situation here. This ink is not being a black, but still being a very dark purple. I was thinking this paper would make it appear black. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a lot darker, hellaciously darker than it was on the Clairfontaine with feathering, tons of it. Every letter is a woolly beast. It does spread to a little bit more than a medium, just a little more than a medium. It doesn't shade. It does hold on to being a purple here. This would not be a great recommendation for me because of the amount of spread and feathers that are going on. It just does not look good. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone that we got on the wet fine nib. No, lot still feathers. I'm distracted by the wet fine directly above it. It still feathers, nowhere near as bad. It still spreads about to a broad. The spread is not as bad as what we saw with the wet fine. It's because looking at them side by side, the spread goes, it's not bad. I'm not happy with it, but it's not bad. And the same with the feathering. I'm not happy with it, but it's not horrible for this paper. There's no shading. It is still a purple. I really still don't like how this looks. It's very distracting how bad this looks. That's what's going on here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we had with the medium. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade. It does not look like a black. It certainly looks like a very dark purple, which is a great thing that it's holding on to it that strong. What's not a great thing? How this looks on the page. Looking at the page underneath, we had one spot with the broad and quite a few with the wet fine that bled through and spotted the page underneath, though the amount of spotting I don't think would stop you from really using it. It wasn't too bad. When we're looking at the back of the page, you definitely could not write back here because it's very deep into the page and you destroy the writing on both sides. It's copy paper after all.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
This ink is certainly a dealer's choice, and it's very consistent in its tone and performance. But if you want that little bit of shading that this does have, then go for a dry, fine pen. Otherwise, ink up your favorite pen and enjoy this for exactly what it is, a great dark purple that just might make people think it's black sometimes.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.